The Winchester Mystery House is widely known as the most haunted Winchester mansion in America. A sprawling architectural nightmare designed by a woman trapped in her own mind. This is the start of the Winchester widow story, a tale of Sarah Winchester, a grieving widow who inherited a daily income of $1,000 in 1881. This was the equivalent of roughly $38,000 every single day. A massive fortune she used to construct a labyrinth of absolute paranoia. For over 3 decades, the hammers never stopped. She spent her wealth on bizarre Winchester house architecture, creating doors that opened into 3-story drops and staircases that led directly into solid ceilings. The public believed she was driven mad by the Sarah Winchester ghosts, the spirits of those killed by her family's repeating rifles. But the real reason for this endless, chaotic construction was not madness. It was locked inside a heavy steel safe in the center of her labyrinth. A safe that her family spent decades trying to open. When that safe was finally cracked, it revealed a secret that turned a ghost story into a cold, calculated financial conspiracy. This is the dark history of Sarah Winchester, the Winchester Repeating Arms fortune, and the architecture of absolute paranoia. Oliver Winchester was not an inventor. He was a clothing manufacturer. But he understood the business of human conflict. In the mid-19th century, firearms were slow. They were unreliable. They were single-shot. Oliver saw an opportunity in the inefficiency of death. He bought the assets of a failing arms company. He hired brilliant engineers to refine a repeating rifle. The result was the Henry rifle. It changed warfare forever. During the American Civil War, soldiers called it the gun you could load on Sunday and shoot all week. The financial mechanics of the Winchester Company were simple. They sold firepower to both sides of any conflict that had money. The company did not just sell weapons. They sold the physical tool of westward expansion. Every bullet fired was a dividend paid to the Winchester family. By the time Oliver died, the company was a global empire. But the wealth generated by this machine of death carried a heavy price. The bill was about to be delivered to a single, unsuspecting heir, who would soon inherit a fortune soaked in blood and a terrifying mandate from the grave. William Wirt Winchester inherited his father's booming empire. This was a colossal corporate machine built on gunpowder, brass, and lead. William was the golden heir to a monopoly that expanded with every conflict on the globe. He married Sarah Pardee. She was not just a decorative socialite. She was a woman of immense intellect, fluent in multiple languages, and deeply cultured. Together, they had everything the Gilded Age could offer, but unlimited capital cannot buy immunity from tragedy. First, their infant daughter Annie died of a rare wasting disease. The grief was paralyzing. Then, 15 years later, tuberculosis claimed William. In 1881, Sarah was left entirely alone. Her family was gone. But the corporate cash machine kept running. She inherited $20 million. She also inherited a 50% stake in the Winchester Repeating Arms Company. This made her one of the wealthiest individuals on the planet. Her daily income exceeded $1,000 every single day. To put that in perspective, the average American worker at the time earned less than $2 a day. Sarah was earning in 24 hours what a laborer could not earn in a lifetime. The money poured in continuously, fueled by the global sale of repeating rifles. It was a self-sustaining financial engine. But Sarah did not want the money. She believed every dollar was soaked in the blood of soldiers, settlers, and indigenous peoples. To her, the fortune was a curse. She believed the company was generating blood currency. To find peace, she sought the guidance of a spiritual medium in Boston. The medium gave her a chilling directive. She must move west, buy a house, and never stop building. The spirits of those killed by the Winchester rifle would guide the construction. If the hammers ever stopped, Sarah would die. She packed her bags and headed to California, leaving the corporate boardrooms behind. But she brought the endless cash flow with her, and the quiet valleys of California were about to witness a building project that defied all laws of architecture and sanity. Sarah Winchester arrived in San Jose, California, in the damp autumn of 1886. She was a tiny figure, draped in heavy black crepe, carrying a fortune that could buy entire cities. She did not seek out the grand estates of Nob Hill. Instead, she purchased an unassuming, unfinished 8-room farmhouse sitting on 161 acres of flat valley land. To her neighbors, she seemed like a grieving widow looking for a quiet retirement. They were entirely wrong. Sarah had no interest in peace. She had a mandate from the dead. She did not hire an architect. She did not draft blueprints. To Sarah, an architect was a liability, a rational mind that would interfere with her supernatural instructions. Instead, she hired a crew of local carpenters. She offered them a simple deal. She would pay them 3 times the standard daily wage. In exchange, they had to work without asking questions. The quiet valley was suddenly shattered by the sound of hammers. It was a sound that would not stop for 36 years. The construction shifted into a relentless 24-hour operation. Shift after shift, the workers labored under the glare of gaslights. Every night, Sarah retreated to her private séance room. It was a blue-painted chamber, accessible only through a secret passage. There, under the cover of darkness, she claimed to commune with the spirits of those slain by the Winchester rifle. The next morning, she would emerge with rough sketches scribbled on napkins and scraps of wallpaper. She handed these chaotic drawings to her foreman. The instructions made no sense. Build a balcony on the inside of a room. Install a window in the floor. Run a staircase directly into the ceiling. The carpenters did not argue. They were being paid a fortune to suspend their logic. Sarah spared no expense. She imported the finest treasures global capital could buy. She bought stained glass windows, custom designed by Louis Comfort Tiffany. Some of them were positioned where they would never see a single ray of sunlight. She ordered exotic hardwoods harvested from the deepest corners of the Amazon basin. She purchased heavy German silver fixtures and imported Italian marble. The house expanded outward and upward like a wooden cancer. It reached 6 stories into the California sky. It contained dozens of bedrooms, multiple grand ballrooms, and hundreds of deep, empty closets. By the turn of the century, she had spent over $5 million on this frantic, chaotic expansion. In today's terms, that is over $150 million dissolved into wood, plaster, and glass. Yet she lived in absolute, crushing isolation. She wore a heavy dark veil whenever she walked through the corridors. If a worker accidentally looked at her face, she fired them on the spot. She slept in a different bedroom every single night, navigating her own maze to confuse the vengeful spirits she believed were hunting her. The mansion was a physical manifestation of her wealth, but it was also a fortress built to keep the physical and spiritual worlds at bay. She believed she had built an unbreakable shield, but the earth beneath her feet was about to remind her that some forces cannot be bought. In the early morning hours of April 18, 1906, the earth shattered Sarah's illusion of absolute control. The great San Francisco earthquake struck with a violent force that ripped through the Santa Clara Valley. The top 3 stories of Sarah's massive 6-story wooden fortress collapsed into a heap of splintered redwood and shattered glass. Heavy brick chimneys fell inward, sealing her inside her own bedroom. For hours, she was trapped in the pitch black, surrounded by the groaning of shifting timbers and the dust of ruined plaster. She did not see this as a natural disaster. To Sarah, the earthquake was an ultimatum from the spirit world. They were angry because she had come too close to finishing the monument. Her response was immediate and extreme. She ordered the collapsed ruins to be boarded up permanently, leaving them to rot. The construction did not stop, but it lost all remnants of sanity. She demanded doors that opened into 3-story drops to the concrete below. She designed staircases that climbed straight into solid ceilings. She constructed chimneys that stopped inches short of the roof, venting smoke into empty rooms. To the outside world, she was a lunatic wasting a fortune. But the board of directors at the Winchester Repeating Arms Company was not laughing. They were terrified. Sarah held a 50% stake in the enterprise. She controlled the voting rights. If she decided to liquidate her shares to fund her architectural madness, she could crash the entire corporate empire. They desperately looked for legal loopholes to declare her incompetent and strip her of control. They failed. Her ownership structure was an ironclad, bulletproof, Gilded Age trust. She refused to sell a single share, starving the corporation of vital capital, while draining every cent of her massive dividends into the dirt. Her desperate relatives watched from a distance as tens of millions of dollars dissolved into the bank accounts of local carpenters. They could not stop her, but they could wait. Their eyes were fixed on the massive steel safe sitting in the deepest recesses of her private quarters. They believed that safe held the ultimate prize. They believed it contained the secret to reclaiming the lost Winchester millions. And when the old woman finally drew her last breath, they were ready to crack it open. Sarah Winchester passed away in her sleep in September of 1922. She was 82 years old. For the first time in 36 years, the hammers stopped. The silence across the San Jose Valley was deafening. It did not last long. Her relatives and lawyers descended on the mansion like vultures before her body was even cold. They did not care about her grief. They did not care about her ghosts. They bypassed the maze of rooms and went straight for the heavy steel safe hidden in her private quarters. This was the moment they had waited decades for. They brought in professional safecrackers to drill the complex lock. They expected to find the remnants of a global empire. Millions of dollars in physical gold, stock certificates, deeds to valuable land. The lock clicked. The heavy steel door swung open. The vultures peered inside. There was no gold. There were no stock certificates. There were only 2 locks of hair from her deceased husband and child, a cheap family tree, and a collection of 13 section wills. The real financial truth was far more devastating than they could have ever imagined. Sarah had not lost her mind. She had executed a brilliant, decades-long asset-stripping strategy. To avoid federal taxes and keep her greedy relatives from seizing her wealth, she had systematically converted her liquid capital into an unsellable, bizarre piece of real estate. She paid her workers 3 times the standard wage because she knew those wages could not be taxed or reclaimed by her family after her death. The house was designed to be completely worthless on the open market. It was an unmarketable labyrinth of dead ends, a physical poison pill. She had successfully spent her entire fortune down to the last penny, leaving her relatives with nothing but a giant, unmarketable wooden monument. The Winchester fortune was gone, permanently dissolved into the very walls of the labyrinth. Her family was left holding a worthless deed to a house of cards, but the destruction of the Winchester legacy was not finished yet. The aftermath of Sarah Winchester's death was a cold bath of financial reality. The sprawling, chaotic labyrinth in San Jose was put on the auction block. A monument that had swallowed over $5 million of Gilded Age wealth sold for a mere fraction of its cost. The hammer fell at just $135,000. It was a financial catastrophe. The investors who purchased the property quickly realized the truth. The house was entirely unlivable. It had no master blueprint. It had no logical flow. It was a monument of pure, unadulterated paranoia. But these investors were capitalists. They realized that if you cannot live in a nightmare, you can always charge admission for it. Within months, they opened the doors to the public. They marketed the bizarre architecture as the work of a woman driven mad by the supernatural. They sold the ghost stories that Sarah had cultivated to keep the world away. The tragedy of her life became a highly profitable sideshow. Meanwhile, the Winchester Repeating Arms Company faced its own grim reckoning. For decades, Sarah had held a 50% stake in the firm. Her constant drain of dividends had starved the corporation of vital reserve capital. Without her massive fortune to prop them up, and facing a brutal post-war market, the company began to bleed cash. The onset of the Great Depression was the final, fatal blow. In 1931, the legendary arms empire collapsed into receivership. The Winchester family lost control of their legacy forever. The company was bought out by the Olin Corporation. The name remained, but the dynasty was dead. Today, the Winchester Mystery House stands as a bizarre monument to guilt, grief, and financial spite. Hundreds of thousands of tourists walk through its dead-end hallways every year. They look for cold spots. They listen for disembodied footsteps. But they are looking for the wrong kind of ghost. The real phantom haunting those corridors is the ghost of a squandered empire. Sarah Winchester proved that the ultimate weapon of the Gilded Age was not a repeating rifle. It was unlimited capital. And she used it to build the most expensive cage in human history. Wealth is a heavy burden. It is even heavier when it is built on the business of death. Sarah Winchester tried to build her way out of a debt she could never truly repay. But she only succeeded in proving a fundamental law of financial gravity. You can buy an empire. You can buy a fortress. But you can never buy peace of mind. If you want to understand the true cost of old money empires, hit the subscribe button. We will see you in the next investigation.